Margaret Turner's right hand closed around the iron tag, hanging from a chain around the auctioneer's neck at exactly 10:47 a.m. on March 14, 1859, in Richmond, Virginia. 3 seconds after he told the assembled buyers that her 6-year-old son would be sold separately to maximize profit. The tag was a standard auction house identification marker, measuring 12 inches long by 2 inches wide, stamped with the auction house logo and her assigned lot number, 347. And it weighed approximately 1.3 pounds of solid iron that could generate tremendous force when swung with the right technique. Meg had been planning this moment for 6 days, ever since she learned she was being sold. And she had spent those 6 days watching how the guards moved, memorizing their positions, calculating angles and distances, and the precise amount of force required to kill a man quickly enough that others couldn't react in time. She had killed animals before. Chickens, pigs, even a bull once when she worked at a Richmond slaughterhouse. And she understood the mechanics of death. How it required disrupting specific systems in the body, how speed mattered more than strength, how surprise was worth more than both combined. Charles Pemberton, the auctioneer, never saw it coming because he was looking at the buyers, not at the woman standing behind him on the platform. Meg moved with the efficiency of someone who had practiced the motion 100 times in her mind. She grabbed the chain, twisted her body to generate rotational force, and swung the iron tag in a wide arc that ended with its edge striking Pemberton in the throat with enough force to crush his larynx and sever his carotid artery. The sound was distinctive. A wet crunch followed by a gurgling gasp as Pemberton's airway collapsed and blood began flooding into his lungs. He dropped to his knees, both hands clutching his throat, and fell forward onto the wooden platform with a thud that made the buyers in the front row jump back. The entire sequence took 1.8 seconds from Meg grabbing the chain to Pemberton hitting the floor. And for another full second, nobody moved because their brains couldn't process what they had just witnessed. A woman killing a white man in front of 60 witnesses in broad daylight. The first guard to react was Jacob Morrison, a 35-year-old former soldier who had been working auction house security for 7 years and had dealt with resistant slaves before, but never with one who attacked rather than fled. He rushed toward Meg from her left side, reaching for the cudgel hanging from his belt. And that was his mistake. He should have shot her immediately. But shooting valuable merchandise went against every instinct he had developed through years of working in an industry that measured human beings in dollars. Meg pivoted toward him, still holding the iron tag by its chain, and swung it in a low arc that caught Morrison in the knee with enough force to shatter his patella. He screamed and went down, and Meg was on him before he hit the ground, driving the edge of the iron tag down onto his temple with both hands, in a strike that fractured his skull and killed him instantly. 2 men dead in 4.2 seconds, and the crowd was still processing what was happening, still frozen in the kind of shock that comes from witnessing something that shouldn't be possible. The second guard, Thomas Reed, was smarter or maybe just faster. He pulled his pistol as he ran toward the platform, but Meg had anticipated this. She grabbed her son Daniel, who had been standing beside her in stunned silence, and pulled him against her body, using him as a human shield in a calculation that was brutally pragmatic and completely effective. Reed couldn't shoot without risking the child, and that moment of hesitation cost him everything. Meg threw the iron tag like a projectile, the chain spinning out behind it, and the weighted tag struck Reed in the face with enough force to break his nose and knock him backward off the platform. He fell into the crowd of buyers, his pistol discharging into the ceiling as he went down. And the gunshot was the spark that transformed shock into chaos. The 87 enslaved people who had been waiting in the holding areas to be auctioned heard the shot and understood that something fundamental had changed, that the order that kept them controlled had been disrupted, and they reacted with the kind of coordinated violence that white Richmond had always feared. The auction house on Wall Street in Richmond was a 3-story brick building that had been conducting slave sales twice weekly since 1842, processing an average of 2,400 people annually through a system designed to be efficient, profitable, and absolutely secure. The building could hold up to 300 enslaved people in holding cells on the first and second floors, with the main auction room on the ground floor opening directly onto Wall Street through double doors that were kept closed during sales to maintain climate control and prevent escapes. Security consisted of 8 guards armed with pistols and cudgels, positioned at strategic points throughout the building, backed up by the Richmond police who maintained a station just 2 blocks away. The system had worked without major incident for 17 years, surviving minor disturbances and individual resistance attempts through overwhelming force, and the knowledge that any enslaved person who attacked a white person would face torture and execution as public spectacle. But the system had never encountered Margaret Turner. Meg had been born in 1831 on a tobacco plantation in Henrico County, 20 miles outside Richmond, to a mother who had been brought from West Africa and a father whose identity was never recorded. She had grown up watching her mother beaten for minor infractions, watching other enslaved people broken by a system designed to crush resistance before it could form. And she had learned early that survival required 2 things: appearing docile while staying constantly alert for opportunities. At age 14, she had been sold to a Richmond merchant named William Bradford, who owned a slaughterhouse and needed workers who could handle the physical demands of killing and butchering animals. Meg worked at Bradford's slaughterhouse for 8 years, learning knife work and animal anatomy, developing upper body strength that was unusual for women of any race, and watching how professional butchers killed efficiently. The precise cuts and strikes that ended life quickly, the understanding of where major arteries ran, how much force was required to break bone, how to read an animal's body language to predict its movements. In 1853, Meg had been sold again, this time to a tavern owner named Joseph Garrett, who needed a cook and cleaning woman. Garrett's tavern on Broad Street catered to working-class men, including a significant number of street fighters who competed in bare-knuckle matches in alleys and warehouses throughout Richmond's industrial district. Meg cooked for these men, served their meals, cleaned their blood off the floors after particularly violent nights, and watched them carefully. She watched how they moved, how they positioned their bodies before striking, how they generated power through hip rotation and weight transfer rather than just arm strength. She watched them practice combinations, watched them discuss strategy and technique, and she filed away every detail. She didn't know why she was learning this. She had no expectation of ever needing combat skills, but observation had become her survival mechanism, and she observed everything. When Garrett died suddenly in 1858 from a stroke, his estate was liquidated and Meg was sold to settle his debts. She was 28 years old, had a 6-year-old son named Daniel, whose father was Garrett, though this was never officially acknowledged, and was considered valuable merchandise, strong, skilled, literate enough to read recipes and market lists, with no recorded history of resistance or escape attempts. She sold for $100 to a slave trader named Marcus Whitfield, who planned to take her and Daniel to New Orleans, where prices were higher. But Whitfield's ship departure was delayed by bad weather, and while waiting, he decided to resell her in Richmond at the next auction, calculating that he could get $300 in Virginia and avoid the risk of the sea journey. This decision, made purely for economic optimization, would cost him his business, his reputation, and nearly his life. The 6 days between Whitfield purchasing Meg and the March 14th auction were spent in the auction house, holding cells, cramped rooms with dirt floors where enslaved people waited for sale. Meg was kept with Daniel in a women's cell that held 14 people, and during those 6 days, she made careful observations. She noted that guards changed shifts at 6 a.m., 2 p.m., and 10 p.m., with the morning shift being slightly less alert because they'd been awake since before dawn. She noted that the main auction room had 2 exits, the double doors to Wall Street and a back door leading to the holding areas, but that the back door was kept locked during auctions to prevent escapes toward the holding cells where other enslaved people might join a disturbance. She noted that guards stood at positions that covered the exits, but left blind spots near the auction platform itself. And most importantly, she noted that every person being auctioned wore an iron identification tag around their neck, a tag that was heavy enough to serve as a weapon if someone had the will to use it. On the morning of March 14th, Meg was awakened at 5:30 a.m. and told she would be in the second group auctioned, scheduled for approximately 10:30 a.m. She was given a bucket of water to wash, told to put on a clean dress that the auction house provided to make her more presentable to buyers, and had the iron tag, stamped with Lot 347, hung around her neck on a chain. The tag hung at roughly sternum height, heavy enough that she felt its weight with every movement, and when she closed her hand around it, she estimated it would take approximately 2 pounds of force to break the chain if she pulled hard enough. The tag's edges weren't sharp, but they weren't rounded either. There were corners and edges that could concentrate force into a small area, the same principle that made an axe blade effective. She spent the next 4 hours sitting in the holding cell with Daniel on her lap, feeling the weight of the iron tag, calculating trajectories and impact points, and making a decision that would change the trajectory of 89 lives. The auction began at 9 a.m. with male workers, considered the most valuable merchandise in Virginia's declining tobacco economy. Meg listened to the auctioneer's voice through the thin walls, heard the rhythmic pattern of his pitch and the buyers' responding bids, counted the minutes until her turn would come. At 10:35 a.m., a guard opened the cell door and called out lot numbers 345 through 350. 6 people, including Meg and Daniel. They were lined up in the corridor, connected by a rope looped through the chains holding their iron tags, and led toward the auction room. The rope connecting them was approximately 40 feet long, allowing about 6 to 7 feet between each person, and it was loose enough that Meg could feel some slack when she tugged gently against it. This was important. If she moved quickly enough, the slack would give her perhaps 2 seconds before the rope pulled tight and alerted the guard holding the other end. The auction room smelled of tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies, a combination that made Meg's nose burn as she stepped through the doorway. Approximately 60 buyers filled the space, sitting on benches or standing along the walls, examining the merchandise with the same clinical attention they might give to livestock. Charles Pemberton, the auctioneer, stood on a raised wooden platform that put him about 3 feet above the floor level, giving buyers a clear view of whoever was being sold. Guards stood at the 2 exits and near the platform, hands resting on their weapons, expressions bored after 17 years of conducting sales without significant incident. The setup was designed to be intimidating, to make enslaved people understand their powerlessness and discourage resistance through psychological weight even before physical force became necessary. It worked on almost everyone. But Meg had spent 6 days deciding that psychological weight meant nothing if you were willing to pay the physical price of defying it. The first person in their group, Lot 345, was a middle-aged man sold quickly for field labor. Then Lot 346, a teenage girl sold for domestic work. Then Meg's turn. She walked onto the platform with Daniel beside her, feeling the iron tag's weight against her chest, and Charles Pemberton began his presentation. Lot 347, female, age 28, skilled cook and household worker, literate, no recorded behavioral issues. Lot 348, male child, age 6, son of Lot 347, healthy, trainable. Pemberton paused, then delivered the sentence that had been inevitable from the moment Meg was brought to auction. Selling separately or together at buyer's preference. though separate sales typically yield higher combined value. This was the moment when Meg's life diverged into two possible futures. In one future, she stood silent while her son was sold away from her, watched him disappear into whatever hell awaited him, survived the loss the way thousands of other enslaved mothers had survived it, by dying inside while their bodies kept working. In the other future, she grabbed the iron tag hanging from her neck and used it to kill the man who had just suggested that profit mattered more than her child. The first future offered survival. The second offered death, probably through torture after capture. Meg chose the second future in less than half a second, her hand closing around the iron tag before Pemberton finished his sentence. And in that choice, she stopped being merchandise and became something that Richmond's slave system had no protocols for handling. A woman who would rather die fighting than live broken. The aftermath of Pemberton's death happened too fast for any organized response. The moment he went down, the moment the first guard charged and Meg killed him, the moment the second guard fell off the platform and his pistol discharged, the 87 enslaved people in the holding cells understood that the auction house's security had been breached. They couldn't see what was happening in the auction room. The walls blocked their view. But they heard the gunshot, heard shouting, heard something that sounded like running feet. And they reacted with the kind of instant coordination that only comes from people who have been watching for opportunities for years. The cells weren't individually locked. They had a single barred door secured by an external bolt that could be lifted from the outside. 4 men in the nearest cell threw themselves against the door simultaneously, and the force of 800 pounds of human weight hitting a bolt that was designed to stop individual escape attempts was enough to bend the metal and partially dislodge it from the doorframe. A woman named Sarah, who had been sold 3 times before and knew auction house procedures, saw the bolt bend and immediately understood what needed to happen. She grabbed the iron identification tag around her neck, Lot 312, and wedged its edge into the gap between the bent bolt and the doorframe, using it as a lever to pry the bolt further out of alignment. 2 men added their strength, pulling on the door while Sarah pushed on the tag, and the bolt gave way with a screech of metal on metal. The door swung open, and 23 people who had been contained in that cell suddenly weren't contained anymore. They poured into the corridor, and within seconds they were attacking the holding area doors of other cells using the same technique. Body weight to bend the bolts, iron tags as prying levers, coordinated effort to overcome mechanisms designed to stop individuals but not groups. In the auction room, Meg was still standing on the platform over 2 dead bodies, still holding the blood-covered iron tag, and the buyers who hadn't fled were scrambling away from her like she was a rabid animal. She could hear noise from the holding areas, understood that something was happening back there, understood that she had perhaps 15 seconds before more guards arrived and killed her. She grabbed Daniel, who had been frozen in shock since the moment she killed Pemberton, and jumped off the platform toward the back door leading to the holding areas. The door was locked, but one of the fallen guards had keys on his belt. Meg dropped to her knees beside Jacob Morrison's body, yanked the keys free while Daniel clung to her back, and fumbled with the lock while her hands shook from adrenaline. The key fit. The lock opened. The door swung inward, revealing a corridor filled with freed slaves who were attacking the remaining cell doors. What happened next transformed individual violence into collective uprising. Meg stood in the doorway between the auction room and the holding area, her clothes covered in blood, still holding the iron tag like a weapon. And she made a sound that was half scream, half roar, a noise that carried the weight of 28 years of accumulated rage. The enslaved people in the corridor turned toward her, saw her standing over dead guards, and understood that the impossible had happened. Someone had killed their captors, survived long enough to tell about it. A man named Jacob, who had been waiting to be sold for the 4th time in 6 years, picked up a wooden bench and threw it through the window of a cell door, shattering the glass and allowing the people inside to climb out. Another woman grabbed a broken piece of the bench and used it to batter down a door that was already weakened by the bolt prying technique. Within 90 seconds of Meg opening the back door, all 6 holding cells were open, and 87 people were free inside a building that had 8 guards, 2 of whom were already dead. The riot that followed would be described in Richmond newspapers as the most violent slave insurrection in Virginia since Nat Turner, though calling it an insurrection was technically incorrect. These people weren't rebelling against their government. They were escaping from a commercial building while defending themselves from people trying to stop them. But technical accuracy mattered less than the visual impact of watching 87 enslaved people overwhelm the auction house's security, kill 4 more guards who tried to stop them, and pour out of the building onto Wall Street in the middle of a Wednesday morning while Richmond's white residents scrambled for safety. The violence was concentrated and strategic. The freed slaves attacked only people who blocked their escape routes, ignored bystanders who got out of the way, and moved with the kind of organized purpose that suggested this wasn't mindless rage, but calculated survival. Meg found herself at the front of this mass exodus, still carrying Daniel, the iron tag still in her free hand. And she understood that they had perhaps 3 minutes before Richmond's police arrived, with enough force to slaughter everyone. 3 minutes to disappear into a city that was designed to make disappearance impossible for black people. 3 minutes to find hiding places that would keep 87 people concealed until nightfall. 3 minutes to transform from freed prisoners into organized resistance. She ran west on Wall Street toward Shockoe Creek, knowing that the creek's steep banks and dense vegetation offered cover, knowing that the city's sewage system connected to the creek through underground passages, knowing this because she had delivered food to workers maintaining those passages during her years at Garrett's Tavern. If they could reach the creek, if they could get into the sewers before the police cordoned off the area, they might actually survive the next 3 hours. The sound of police whistles cut through the air, sharp and urgent, and Meg ran faster, her lungs burning, Daniel's weight making her shoulders ache. Behind her, the other freed slaves followed in a ragged column that stretched 30 yards down Wall Street, some carrying improvised weapons, some injured from the fight in the auction house, all running toward Shockoe Creek because Meg was running that way, and she looked like someone who had a plan. They reached the creek embankment at 11:04 a.m., 17 minutes after Meg killed Charles Pemberton, and she led them down the steep slope toward the water's edge, where a storm drain outlet emerged from the embankment. A circular opening 4 feet in diameter that led into Richmond's underground drainage system. Meg didn't hesitate. She climbed into the drain opening with Daniel, turned to help the next person in, and started moving into darkness that would either hide them or become their tomb. The storm drain swallowed them one by one. 89 people climbing into a concrete tube that measured exactly 4 feet in diameter and sloped downward at a 7-degree angle into absolute darkness. Meg went first with Daniel clutched against her chest, crawling on her hands and knees because the pipe was too small to stand in, feeling the cold water that flowed along the bottom, soaking through her dress within seconds. The water was only 3-4 inches deep, but it carried the sewage of 38,000 Richmond residents, mixed with industrial runoff from tanneries and slaughterhouses, creating a smell so overwhelming that several people vomited within the first 30 seconds of entering the pipe. Meg kept moving forward, counting her breaths to maintain control, knowing that if she stopped or panicked, the 88 people behind her would pile up in the tunnel entrance where police bullets could reach them. The physics of moving 89 people through a 4-foot pipe presented problems that Meg solved through trial and error in real time. She quickly learned that crawling forward with Daniel on her back was impossible. The pipe's low ceiling made her back scrape against the concrete ceiling with every movement. Instead, she had to hold Daniel against her chest with one arm while using her other arm and both legs to propel herself forward. a movement that was exhausting and slow, but that kept both of them low enough to avoid hitting their heads. Behind her, the other escaped slaves adapted the same technique, creating a human chain that moved at approximately 15 feet per minute through a tunnel that Meg estimated was at least 400 feet long before it connected to larger passages. At that rate, getting everyone through the initial drain pipe would take nearly 30 minutes. 30 minutes during which they would be completely vulnerable if police discovered their entry point. The sounds in the tunnel created a sensory landscape that Meg navigated by instinct and memory. Water flowing generated a constant rushing noise that echoed off the concrete walls, making it impossible to have normal conversation. People had to shout to be heard over the sound. Every movement created scraping sounds as bodies dragged against the pipe's bottom. Every breath became amplified in the confined space. Every cough or cry from Daniel echoed back from the darkness ahead. But beneath these immediate sounds, Meg could hear something else, a deeper resonance that suggested larger spaces ahead, possibly the main collection chambers where multiple drain pipes converged before flowing into Chaco Creek. She moved toward that sound, trusting that larger spaces would give them room to organize and breathe before continuing deeper into Richmond's underground network. After approximately 12 minutes of crawling, the pipe opened into a circular chamber that measured roughly 15 feet in diameter and 10 feet high, tall enough to stand in, wide enough for multiple people to occupy simultaneously. Meg emerged from the pipe into knee-deep water, pulling Daniel up and moving to the side to make room for the next person. The chamber was pitch black, except for the faint gray light coming from the pipe entrance 200 feet behind them. A light so dim it barely registered, but that at least provided some reference point for orientation. As people emerged from the pipe, Meg counted them, keeping track through touch and sound since visual confirmation was impossible. She reached 47 before the flow from the pipe stopped, meaning 42 people were still in the entry tunnel or still emerging from the auction house. The wait stretched to 23 minutes before the next person emerged, and Meg understood what had happened. Police had discovered the entry point and sealed it, meaning roughly 25 people hadn't made it into the sewers at all. Those people would be captured, likely killed as examples, their bodies displayed to deter future resistance. Meg felt a flash of guilt that lasted approximately 2 seconds before survival instinct overrode emotion. She had 64 people in an underground chamber with limited air, no light, and no clear path forward except deeper into a sewer system she knew only from second-hand descriptions heard years ago. The immediate tactical problem was orientation. The chamber had 4 pipe openings that she could feel by moving around the perimeter, each pipe leading in a different direction, and she had to choose which one would take them toward the creek's downstream outlet, rather than back toward the city center or into dead ends. Meg made the decision based on water flow. She moved to each pipe opening in turn, feeling the current with her hands, and chose the pipe where water flowed strongest because strong current meant the pipe led downhill toward the creek. This pipe was larger than the entry drain, approximately 6 feet in diameter, allowing people to move in a crouched position rather than crawling. She organized the group before entering. Children in the middle of the column where they'd be protected. Strongest adults at the front and rear, anyone injured being helped by those who weren't. The organization took 7 minutes, conducted entirely through touch and whispered commands, and then they moved into the larger pipe, leaving the chamber behind and descending deeper into Richmond's underground. The journey through Richmond's sewer system would cover approximately 2.3 miles and take 11 hours. 11 hours during which 64 people navigated through complete darkness, using only sound, touch, and the flow of water as guides. The system had been constructed in 1847 using the best engineering practices available at the time, which meant it was functional but not sophisticated. gravity-fed drainage that collected rainwater and sewage from Richmond's streets and buildings, channeling it through progressively larger pipes until it emptied into Shockoe Creek and then into the James River. The engineers who designed the system never anticipated people using it as an escape route, never considered that the very infrastructure meant to keep the city clean would become a highway for resistance. The first major obstacle appeared 43 minutes into their underground journey, when the pipe they were following suddenly dropped vertically into a junction chamber approximately 12 feet below their current level. Meg discovered this by almost falling into it. She was moving forward in the darkness, hand extended to feel for obstacles, when suddenly there was no pipe floor beneath her fingers, just empty space that meant either a shaft or a gap. She stopped immediately, whispered a warning to the person behind her, and carefully explored the edge of the drop. Her fingers found iron rungs set into the wall, a ladder leading down, and she understood they were at a junction point where multiple pipes from higher elevations converged into a lower collection system. Descending this ladder while carrying Daniel in complete darkness, with 63 other people waiting to follow, took every bit of courage she possessed. She went first. Daniel wrapped around her back this time, his arms tight around her neck and his legs locked around her waist. She found the first rung by touch, tested its strength with her weight, and stepped down. The iron was slick with algae and sewage. Her hands kept slipping, and twice she nearly lost her grip before reaching the bottom. The junction chamber she emerged into was larger than the first one they'd encountered, perhaps 20 feet across, with water flowing through it at a faster rate that created a current strong enough to knock her off balance when she stepped off the ladder. She braced herself against the wall, called up to the next person to come down carefully, and waited while 63 people descended one by one. A process that took 94 minutes and resulted in 3 people falling the last few feet when their hands slipped on the wet rungs. The injuries from those falls were minor, bruises and scrapes rather than broken bones, but they highlighted the danger of their situation. Meg realized that moving 64 people through underground passages in complete darkness was causing injuries that would accumulate over hours, making people weaker and slower, potentially leaving them unable to move when they finally reached whatever exit point they were seeking. She made a decision that seemed counterintuitive, but that proved tactically sound. She called for a rest stop right there in the junction chamber, despite being only about 1/3 of the way through the sewer system. People sat in the cold water, backs against the walls, sharing body heat and allowing their breathing to steady. Meg used this time to organize people into smaller groups of 8, each group led by someone who seemed capable of staying calm under pressure, each group responsible for helping their own injured or exhausted members. While they rested, Meg explored the junction chamber, feeling along the walls for the exit pipes. She found 3 openings, each approximately 6 feet in diameter, and again used water flow to determine direction. The strongest current flowed through the center pipe, which suggested it was the main drainage route toward the creek. But she noticed something else. The center pipe had a slight echo quality that the other 2 lacked, suggesting it was longer and possibly led to a larger space downstream. She chose that pipe not just because of the water flow, but because larger spaces downstream meant potential exit points, or at least areas where the group could rest again before continuing. The decision was based on incomplete information and educated guessing, the kind of tactical thinking that kept them alive when certainty was impossible. They entered the center pipe at 1:47 p.m., approximately 3 hours after entering the sewer system, and immediately encountered a new problem. The pipe's slope increased dramatically, creating a current strong enough that people had to brace themselves to avoid being swept downstream. The water level rose from knee-deep to waist-deep in some sections, and the coldness of it began causing hypothermia symptoms in the children and elderly who had been immersed for hours. Meg could feel Daniel shivering against her, his small body trembling uncontrollably, and she knew they had perhaps 2 more hours before the cold started killing people regardless of whether they escaped or not. She increased their pace, pushing forward through the current, shouting back warnings about obstacles and changes in pipe direction, driving them toward whatever exit existed downstream. The rats came next, an infestation that Richmond's sewer system supported by the thousands, feeding on waste and breeding in the dark passages where humans rarely ventured. Meg felt them first as movement in the water, furry bodies brushing against her legs, then as a chittering sound that echoed through the pipe ahead. The colony they encountered had made a nest where the pipe widened into another junction, and the sudden intrusion of 64 humans disturbed them into defensive aggression. Rats climbed up people's clothing, bit at exposed skin, created a panic that threatened to scatter the group. Meg reacted by grabbing rats with her bare hands and throwing them as hard as she could back upstream, a violent motion that the others imitated. Within 3 minutes, the rats dispersed, leaving behind bite wounds on 17 people and a fear of moving forward into more colonies. But they had no choice except forward. Behind them was capture and death. Ahead was unknown danger, but possible survival. Meg kept moving, and the group followed, learning to make noise as they advanced, shouting, banging on the pipe walls, creating sounds that warned rats to flee before humans arrived. The technique worked, mostly, though they encountered 3 more colonies over the next 2 hours, each requiring the same violent dispersal tactics, each leaving more bites and scratches that would become infected in the days to come. The accumulated injuries were mounting: rat bites, falls, hypothermia, exhaustion. And Meg understood they were approaching the limit of what the group could endure. They needed to reach an exit within the next hour, or people would start dying underground. At 4:23 p.m., 6 hours after entering the sewer system, the pipe they were following emerged into a space so large that the echo of their voices suggested a chamber measuring at least 40 feet across. This was the main collection point where all of Richmond's western drainage converged before flowing into Shockoe Creek, a massive underground reservoir that held water during heavy rains to prevent flooding. The chamber had been built with a maintenance access, a vertical shaft leading up to street level, sealed with an iron grate that prevented unauthorized entry but allowed ventilation and inspection. Meg discovered this shaft by literally walking into it, her hands finding the circular wall and then the ladder rungs leading upward. She climbed 15 feet, felt the iron grate blocking the top, and pushed. The grate didn't move. It was locked or bolted from the outside. Meg climbed back down and assembled the strongest men in the group. She explained what she'd found, and together they devised a plan that was simple but physically demanding. 4 men would climb the ladder together, position themselves on the rungs with their backs against the grate, and push simultaneously with leg strength rather than arm strength. This would generate approximately 800 or 1,000 pounds of upward force, possibly enough to break whatever mechanism secured the grate. The 4 men climbed, positioned themselves, and pushed on Meg's count. The grate didn't move. They pushed again, harder, veins standing out on their necks from the effort. Still nothing. On the 3rd attempt, something gave. A metallic screech followed by movement, the grate shifting upward half an inch before dropping back into place. They pushed a 4th time, and the grate lifted completely, sliding aside with a grinding sound that echoed through the chamber. Gray daylight flooded down the shaft, the first light they'd seen in 6 hours, and several people began crying at the sight of it. But Meg knew they couldn't exit there. The shaft opened onto a street somewhere in Richmond, probably in a residential area. And climbing out one by one would take time, during which someone would inevitably see them and alert authorities. The shaft was useful for ventilation and orientation, but not for escape. Instead, she used the light coming down the shaft to explore the collection chamber and discovered what she'd been searching for: a horizontal tunnel approximately 8 feet in diameter that led south toward Shockoe Creek. Large enough to walk through upright, with a gentle downstream slope that promised an exit somewhere outside the city proper. They entered this tunnel at 4:51 p.m., moving faster now that they could partially see using the dim light filtering down from the open grate behind them. The tunnel was the most sophisticated part of Richmond's sewer system, built with brick archways and periodic support columns that suggested it was old, possibly dating to Richmond's original construction in the late 1700s. The brickwork was deteriorating in places, with gaps where mortar had eroded and tree roots had penetrated from above. But the structure remained sound enough to carry them forward. They walked for approximately 47 minutes, covering roughly half a mile, before the tunnel ended at a waterfall. Not a natural waterfall, but an engineered one where the sewer system's discharge dropped 15 feet into Shockoe Creek. The waterfall presented their exit, but also their greatest danger. The drop was too far to jump safely, especially with children and injured people. The water at the bottom was deep enough to prevent fatal impact, but shallow enough that landing badly could break legs. And most critically, the waterfall was visible from the creek banks, meaning anyone standing near the creek when they emerged would witness 64 people emerging from Richmond's sewer system. Meg spent 11 minutes studying the drop, feeling along the walls for handholds, calculating trajectories and impact forces, before she found the solution: a series of brick support buttresses that projected from the wall at 3-foot intervals, creating a makeshift ladder down the side of the waterfall. The buttresses hadn't been designed as a climbing aid, but they served that function adequately if you were desperate enough. Meg went down first, again carrying Daniel, finding footholds on the narrow brick projections, her arms shaking from exhaustion and fear. She reached the bottom, stood waist-deep in Shockoe Creek's cold water, and looked up at the waterfall with the setting sun behind her, casting orange light across the falling sewage. The scene would have been beautiful if it wasn't so desperate. She called up for the next person, and the descent began. 63 people climbing down one by one, some slipping and falling the last few feet, others making it safely, all of them eventually standing in the creek and wading toward the far bank, where a dense vegetation offered concealment. By the time the last person descended, it was 6:34 p.m., 8.5 hours after they'd entered the sewer system. They had traveled 2.3 miles underground, navigated through complete darkness for most of that journey, survived rats and falls and hypothermia and exhaustion, and emerged outside Richmond city limits in a wooded area that bordered the creek. They were wet, filthy, injured, and exhausted, but they were alive and free, at least temporarily. Meg counted heads and confirmed that all 64 people who had entered the sewers had emerged. No one lost, no one left behind. This would later be considered remarkable, almost impossible given the conditions they'd faced. But in that moment, Meg was too tired to appreciate the achievement. She just wanted to get away from Richmond before darkness fell and hunting parties organized. The group split into smaller units for travel, understanding that 64 people moving together would be too visible, too easy to track. Meg organized them into 8 groups of 8, each group led by one of the people she'd identified as capable during the sewer journey. They would travel north toward Fredericksburg, staying off main roads, moving at night, hiding during the day, heading for the Rappahannock River, which marked the boundary between southern Virginia and the more contested Middle region, where Union sympathizers might offer help. The plan was rough, based on information Meg had gathered over years of listening to travelers talk in Garrett's Tavern, but it was better than no plan at all. She took the first group, herself Daniel, and 6 others who had proven reliable underground, and began walking north through the woods as the sun set behind them. The first night of travel covered approximately 8 miles, moving through forests and fields, avoiding roads and settlements, navigating by stars when the moon rose and by feel when clouds blocked the sky. Meg had no compass, no map, just a general understanding that north meant safety and south meant death. They walked until 3 a.m., then found a dense thicket where they could hide during daylight hours, and collapsed into exhausted sleep while 2 people kept watch. The other 7 groups scattered in different directions, some heading north like Meg's group, others going west toward the mountains, others attempting to reach the coast and find ships that might carry them to northern states. This dispersal was tactical. If authorities caught one group, the others might still escape. But it also meant they would likely never see each other again, that the community formed in the sewers would dissolve into individual survival attempts. Over the next 18 days, Meg's group covered 127 miles through Virginia countryside, stealing food from farms and smokehouses, avoiding towns and plantations, traveling exclusively at night. They lost 1 person to infection from rat bites, a woman named Martha who developed sepsis and died on the 6th day, despite everything Meg tried to save her. They crossed the Rappahannock River on day 11, wading through cold water that was chest-deep at its deepest point. Daniel riding on Meg's shoulders and crying from fear the entire crossing. They reached Fredericksburg on day 15, found a Quaker family who operated a safe house, and rested for 2 days while the Quakers arranged passage to Pennsylvania. The Quaker family, named Ellis, provided the first reliable information about what had happened in Richmond after the riot. The auction house had burned completely. Whether from the chaos of the riot or from deliberate arson wasn't clear. 4 guards had died initially, with 3 more dying from injuries in the days that followed. The 25 people who hadn't made it into the sewers had been captured, and 18 of them had been hanged publicly in Richmond's main square as examples to discourage future resistance. 7 others had been sold to plantation owners in the Deep South with explicit instructions that they be worked to death as additional punishment. The auction house owner, Marcus Whitfield, had been financially ruined and had fled to North Carolina to avoid his creditors. Charles Pemberton's family had demanded murder charges against anyone captured. But since the primary killer, Meg, had escaped, their demand remained unfulfilled. The Ellises also provided something unexpected, information about the other groups that had split off from the main group. Of the 8 groups that had emerged from the sewers, 3 had been captured within the first week. 2 had reached Union-controlled territory in Maryland and were presumed safe. The remaining 3, including Meg's group, were still unaccounted for, which the Ellises interpreted as good news, since bad news traveled faster than no news. This meant potentially 32 to 40 people had successfully escaped Richmond and avoided recapture. A number that seemed impossible until you remembered that they had done something equally impossible by surviving 11 hours underground. From Fredericksburg, the Ellis family arranged transport to Philadelphia via the Underground Railroad network, a series of safe houses and guides that moved escaped slaves north through Pennsylvania. Meg and her group traveled in the back of a wagon hidden under hay bales, a journey that took 4 days, and deposited them in Philadelphia on April 9, 1859, 26 days after the riot. In Philadelphia, they were processed through the Mother Bethel AME Church, which served as a coordination center for escaped slaves, providing food, clothing, medical care, and assistance with finding housing and work. The church's records, preserved in their archives, include an entry dated April 9, 1859. Received 8 souls from Virginia, led by MT female, escaped via Richmond sewers after violent resistance. Multiple injuries requiring medical attention. One child, age 6, generally healthy. Group leader demonstrates exceptional organizational capability and should be employed in coordination work. Meg spent the first week in Philadelphia simply recovering. The church provided housing in a boarding house for Black residents, and she and Daniel shared a small room where they slept for 16 hours a day, their bodies demanding rest after weeks of constant movement and stress. When she finally felt strong enough to walk around the neighborhood, she discovered a community that was both familiar and alien. Black people living openly, working for wages, walking streets without fear of being questioned about their papers or their destinations. It was the freedom she had imagined during 6 days in the auction house holding cells. But experiencing it was different from imagining it. The freedom came with responsibilities she hadn't anticipated. Finding work, earning money, making decisions about Daniel's education and future. She was 28 years old, could read and write, had skills in cooking and household management, but had never had to navigate a free society where her labor was compensated rather than extracted. The Mother Bethel AME Church employed her as a coordinator for newly arrived escaped slaves, recognizing that her experience navigating the sewer system and organizing 64 people in crisis made her uniquely qualified to help others adapt to freedom. She worked at the church for the next 3 years, interviewing hundreds of people who had escaped slavery, documenting their stories, helping them find housing and work, and learning that her experience in Richmond wasn't unique. It was extreme, but not unprecedented. Other people had killed their captors and escaped. Other groups had used infrastructure like sewers or railway tunnels to flee. What made the Richmond riot significant wasn't its tactics, but its scale. 89 people escaping simultaneously from a major urban auction house, 64 surviving the escape, and the destruction of a commercial building that had been central to Virginia's slave trade for 17 years. In 1862, when the Civil War reached Philadelphia's doorstep and the Union Army began recruiting Black soldiers, Meg enlisted. She was 31 years old, had spent 3 years helping escaped slaves adapt to freedom, and believed that fighting was more effective than coordination. She served in a support unit attached to the Army of the Potomac, initially assigned to cooking and laundry duties, but eventually transferred to reconnaissance work after officers realized she could navigate terrain and organize information with unusual efficiency. She participated in 12 combat operations, though her specific role was never officially documented because the Army didn't acknowledge that Black women served in combat capacities. Her unofficial role involved infiltrating Confederate-held territory, gathering intelligence about troop movements, and occasionally eliminating sentries when stealth required it. The iron auction tag she had used to kill Charles Pemberton remained with her throughout the war, cleaned and polished until the blood was gone, but the maker's mark remained visible. Richmond Auction House, Lot 347, March 14, 1859. She kept it wrapped in cloth, stored in a leather pouch that hung around her neck, a physical reminder of the morning when she decided death was preferable to submission. After the war ended in 1865, she had the tag mounted on a wooden base with a brass plaque that read, "With this object, freedom began. Richmond, Virginia, March 14, 1859. She kept this mounted tag on the table in her Philadelphia home for the next 41 years. And when people asked about it, she told the story exactly as it happened. No embellishment, no justification, just the facts of what she had done and why. Daniel Turner, who had been 6 years old during the riot and had spent 11 hours underground clutching his mother, grew up to become a physician. He attended Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, then earned his medical degree from Howard University in 1878, and established a practice in Philadelphia that served the city's Black community for 43 years. He specialized in treating the kinds of injuries and illnesses that resulted from poverty and discrimination. infections from inadequate sanitation, malnutrition from insufficient food access, injuries from dangerous work conditions. He never forgot the 11 hours underground, never forgot the sound of his mother killing 3 men to keep him from being sold away. And he channeled that memory into medicine that saved approximately 4,200 lives over his career, according to records preserved by his practice. The other survivors of the Richmond sewer escape scattered across the northern United States and Canada, most of them adopting new names and disappearing into black communities where they could build lives without the constant threat of recapture. Of the 64 who emerged from the sewers, records confirm that 52 reached Union territory safely. 4 were captured during the journey north. 2 died from injuries or illness during travel, and 6 disappeared without record. The 52 who survived included people who became teachers, ministers, business owners, soldiers in the Union Army, and activists in the abolitionist movement. Their collective impact on the communities they joined was documented in letters, diaries, and church records that preserved their stories even when official histories ignored them. The Richmond slave market never reopened after the March 14th riot. The building burned completely on the night of March 15th. Whether from the chaos of the riot or from deliberate arson remains disputed, though witnesses reported seeing fires start in 3 separate locations simultaneously, suggesting coordinated action. The financial losses from the building's destruction, combined with the death of Charles Pemberton, whose expertise in conducting auctions was not easily replaceable, effectively ended Richmond's dominance in Virginia's slave trade. Other cities took over the business, but none achieved Richmond's previous volume or efficiency. The Richmond City Council passed new ordinances requiring auction houses to install reinforced security measures, including steel-barred holding cells, armed guards at a ratio of 1 guard per 10 enslaved people, and prohibition against bringing more than 20 people into a single building simultaneously for sale. These measures, intended to prevent future riots, actually made the slave trade less efficient and less profitable, contributing to its decline in Virginia during the final years before the Civil War. The tactical lessons from Meg's sewer escape were studied by abolitionists and later by historians of resistance movements. The key tactical innovations included using infrastructure designed for other purposes as escape routes, accepting high casualty rates in exchange for even partial success. 25 captured and killed, but 64 escaped, represented a ratio that most military operations would consider acceptable. Organizing large groups into smaller units for travel to reduce detection risk, and willingness to use lethal violence immediately, rather than attempting negotiation or gradual resistance. These tactics appeared in other escape attempts throughout the 1850s, suggesting that information about the Richmond riot spread through enslaved communities and influenced subsequent resistance strategies. The most significant long-term impact came from something unexpected: the documentation. Multiple witnesses had seen the riot, seen Meg kill 3 men, seen 89 people emerge from the auction house and disappear into the city. These witnesses included enslaved people who were later freed, white residents who sympathized with abolition, and even some slave owners who were horrified by the violence but impressed by its organization. Over the next 6 years, 23 people wrote accounts of what they had witnessed on March 14, 1859, and these accounts were collected by William Still, a prominent abolitionist and historian who was documenting the Underground Railroad's operations. Still published a book in 1872 titled The Underground Railroad Records that included a detailed chapter about the Richmond riot, making Meg's story part of the historical record before oral tradition could distort it beyond recognition. Still's book identified Meg by name: Margaret Turner, also known as Meg, born approximately 1831 in Henrico County, Virginia. sold multiple times before the March 1859 riot, currently residing in Philadelphia and working for the Mother Bethel AME Church. The identification was deliberate. Meg had been living under her own name since arriving in Philadelphia, refusing to hide or use an alias. And she cooperated with Still's research because she wanted the story documented accurately. She provided him with dates, names, tactical details, and the iron auction tag that she had kept for 12 years by the time Still's book was published. Still photographed the tag, creating a visual record that historians could reference when verifying the story's authenticity. In 1892, a reporter from the Philadelphia Tribune interviewed Meg, who was 61 years old and still working as a coordinator for escaped slaves, despite the fact that slavery had been abolished 27 years earlier. The reporter asked her whether she regretted killing 3 men. Meg's response was recorded verbatim. "I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret that I did it. They were trying to sell my child. I would kill them again under the same circumstances. I would kill 100 men before I let them separate me from my child. That's not violence. That's protection. People who call it violence are confused about who the real criminals were." This interview was published on March 14, 1892, exactly 33 years after the riot, and it sparked renewed interest in the story. Church groups invited Meg to speak about her experience, and she accepted some invitations, delivering speeches that were characterized by witnesses as direct, unsentimental, and focused on tactics rather than emotions. She explained how she had planned the attack, how she had observed guard positions, how she had calculated that killing the auctioneer would create enough chaos to enable escape. She described the sewer system navigation as terrifying but manageable if you paid attention to water flow and sound. She answered questions about whether she had been afraid, and her response was always the same. Fear doesn't matter. What matters is whether you move forward despite fear or let fear stop you. In 1899, Meg was diagnosed with consumption, tuberculosis, likely contracted from years of exposure to cold water and poor sanitation during her time underground and during the war. She declined rapidly over the next 7 years, her body weakening as the infection spread through her lungs. She died on January 17, 1906, at age 75, in her Philadelphia home with Daniel beside her. Her obituary in the Philadelphia Tribune ran to 2,300 words, documenting her life, her role in the Richmond riot, her work helping escaped slaves, and her service during the Civil War. The obituary concluded, "Margaret Turner lived as a free woman for 47 years after killing 3 men to prevent her child from being sold. She never expressed regret for that violence, never apologized, never suggested that there was any other choice she could have made. She lived with absolute clarity about what she had done and why. That clarity is her legacy." The iron auction tag was donated to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in 1907 by Daniel Turner, who believed it should be preserved as evidence of what resistance looked like when survival required it. The tag is currently displayed in the museum's American Democracy exhibition, mounted on its wooden base with a brass plaque reading, "With this object, freedom began." Next to it is a placard that explains the March 14, 1859 riot in clinical language. On this date, Margaret Turner killed 3 men at a Richmond slave auction using this iron identification tag as a weapon, triggering a riot that resulted in 89 escapes. Her actions represent one of the most effective uses of individual violence to enable collective escape in the history of American slavery. The Smithsonian also houses 126 other objects that were used by escaped slaves as tools, weapons, or evidence during their journeys to freedom. Keys hidden in clothing seams, fragments of chains kept as proof of bondage, improvised weapons fashioned from farm tools, maps drawn on fabric that could be hidden inside garments. These objects collectively document thousands of individual decisions to resist, to escape, to fight when fighting was necessary. Margaret Turner's iron tag is the most famous of these objects because its story is the most thoroughly documented. But it represents a pattern rather than an exception. People used whatever they had to become free. And when what they had was violence, they used that. The Richmond Riot's tactical innovations were studied by civil rights activists in the 1950s and 1960s who were developing strategies for confronting state violence. While the civil rights movement generally emphasized nonviolent resistance, organizers acknowledged that Meg's willingness to use immediate, overwhelming violence to protect her child represented a form of resistance that couldn't be dismissed as immoral or unjustifiable. Activists debated whether similar tactics could be applied to contemporary struggles, with some arguing that self-defense was always legitimate, and others arguing that violence would undermine public support. The debate never reached definitive resolution, but Meg's story remained a reference point, an example of violence that achieved its immediate goal, escape, even though it came at high cost: 25 dead, property destruction, heightened retaliation against others. Modern historians analyze the Richmond Riot through multiple frameworks: as evidence of enslaved people's agency and resistance, as a case study in the effectiveness of violent resistance under specific conditions, as documentation of infrastructure being repurposed for revolutionary purposes, and as a family story about a mother protecting her child. All these frameworks are valid. Meg was simultaneously an agent of resistance, a tactical innovator, an infrastructure hacker, and a mother who loved her son enough to kill for him. These roles weren't separate. They were integrated into a single person making decisions under extreme pressure, calculating outcomes, accepting risks, and living with consequences. The 64 people who survived the sewer escape went on to live collective 2,847 years of freedom that wouldn't have existed without Meg's initial violence. They had children who had children who had children, creating family lines that currently include approximately 4,200 descendants, according to genealogical research conducted by the African American Genealogy Group in 2018. These descendants include teachers, physicians, lawyers, activists, artists, and ordinary people living ordinary lives that their ancestors couldn't have imagined during those 11 hours underground. The mathematics of survival. 3 deaths producing 64 escapes, producing thousands of descendants living in freedom, represents a calculation that Meg made in the 1.8 seconds between grabbing the iron tag and swinging it at Charles Pemberton's throat. She decided that his death mattered less than her child's freedom, and that calculation rippled forward through 165 years of consequences. The photograph taken in 1904, showing 4 elderly siblings reunited after being sold apart, wasn't connected to Meg's story. It was a different family, a different narrative of separation and reunion. But the photograph's existence in 2024 proved that some families managed to find each other despite slavery's deliberate destruction of family bonds. Meg and Daniel never had to search for each other because they stayed together, bound by violence that prevented separation. That violence, 3 men dead in 47 seconds, was the price Meg paid for keeping her family intact. Whether that price was too high depends on whether you're measuring in white lives lost or black lives preserved, whether you're prioritizing property rights or human rights, whether you believe that some systems must be destroyed violently because they cannot be reformed peacefully. The iron tag sits in its display case in the Smithsonian, silent and permanent, stamped with numbers that identified a woman as merchandise in 1859, and that now identify her as a revolutionary in 2024. The tag weighs 1.3 pounds. It measures 12 inches by 2 inches. It killed 3 men in less than 1 minute and enabled 64 people to escape slavery. These facts coexist without contradiction. The tag is simultaneously a tool of oppression. It was made to mark enslaved people as property, and an instrument of liberation. It was used to kill the people who tried to enforce that property claim. This dual nature makes it uncomfortable to study, uncomfortable to display, uncomfortable to acknowledge, but acknowledging uncomfortable truths is how history moves from myth to understanding, from simplified narratives to complex recognition that people like Margaret Turner existed, made impossible choices, and changed outcomes through violence that we can condemn morally while admitting tactically worked. The legacy of March 14, 1859, isn't that violence solved slavery. It didn't. Slavery required a war to destroy it, required 620,000 deaths, 4 years of systematic destruction before it finally ended. But Meg's violence solved a specific problem for 64 specific people on one specific day, and those people lived free because she killed. That's the legacy. Not that violence is good, but that sometimes it's the only option remaining when every other option has been systematically eliminated by people who benefit from your powerlessness. Meg understood this at age 28. She demonstrated it in 47 seconds of focused brutality. And she lived with the consequences for 47 years without apology or regret. Because she knew that survival sometimes requires you to become what the world fears so that your child doesn't have to become what the world demands.